Everyone, James here, bringing you another review. Today going to be talking about a giallo by one of the most big Italian directors that dabbled in all kinds of genres and stuff like that. And that film I'm talking about, I think it's particularly interesting also just to analyze in terms of the year that it was released. And so the film is So Sweet, So Perverse from 1969, directed by Umberto and Lenzi, written by another big player in the industry, Ernesto Gastaldi, and produced by Luciano Martino, starring Carol Baker, and I'm sorry for the terrible pronunciation that is about to come, but Jean-Louis Trintignant. So I just say that last part as fast as I can and try not to mess it up too bad. I'm sure I failed in such accounts, but we will attempt to say the names here. So the quick synopsis I pulled off of Letterboxd is industrialist Jean is living a jet-set life in late 60s Paris. He comes to the aid of a frightened young woman, Nicole, who's under the domineering control of her abusive boyfriend, Klaus. Although married, John develops a romantic relationship with Nicole. However, he may have gotten himself involved in more than he bargained for. So first, a little bit about Lenzi. For me, there are certain directors that I will absolutely ride or die with. Someone like Lucio Fulci, I even his failures, I'm not someone... I tend to like them. Lenzi, my feelings are definitely a little bit more mixed. I do like a good number of his films, but for me at least, he tends to be a little bit more up and down. Even more so than even Fulci. Lenzi really worked in all kinds of genres, coming from like Euro-spy, westerns. I think he's probably most well known for his kind of horror films from the 80s, but also his cannibal films too, but also his poliziotteschi, things like Almost Human, which is one of my personal favorite Fulcis. If you are a Giallo fan and have not seen that one, or if you're a poliziotteschi one fan, absolutely check that one out. That's a must view. I don't know if everyone's going to love that film, but that might be number one on my Umberto Lenzi list. Probably seen about 30 of his films at this point. And so he's one of those directors where there are some of these people where you're going to rewatch the film and you're going to enjoy it. For me, I'm always a little bit hesitant on Lenzi. Sometimes there's been a handful of films that I've rewatched from him, and my rating is actually lowered. So a bit hesitant to rewatch this one, but I saw what I think is probably the chief influence on this film, Diabolique from 1955, the classic French film, fairly recently. So I wanted to kind of check out sort of the influences from that film. I also recently saw Hex, a great Hong Kong film that's inspired by that one too. Definitely check that one out too. That one's 1980 and has some... it adds to the spiritual elements, shall we say, but is, absolutely worth watching too. So I wanted to come back to these films and just see kind of the influences and how they held up, because previously it had been quite some time since I had seen Diabolique. I think the last time I saw it was probably 17, 18 years ago, and so wanting to come back and sort of see the influences and things like that. And the influence, if you see Diabolique anywhere close to this film, it's quite obvious. It's definitely the number one inspiration for this movie. What's interesting about that is that film is usually not as associated with Gialli as other films that came before it. Maybe things like Psycho, or the slashers are often associated heavily with Giallo too. But Diabolique, I think, played a really, really important and pivotal role in quite a lot of the Gialli that came out pre-Bird with the Crystal Plumage, which really kind of solidified and kind of created a lot of these really familiar Giallo tropes that we would come to know. Black Glove Killer, a little bit more of the body count film where you can sort of expect to kill every 15 to 25 minutes or so. But really, Argento was riffing on kind of Bava, who came before, most notably Blood and Black Lace. So that's really what we associate Giallo with, sort of like the fetishistic black gloves, things like that sort. And so, but one thing to note is that before Bird with the Crystal Plumage came out, these things were not quite as prevalent. So a lot of the Giallis on the 60s is far more influenced by Diabolique rather than the Mario Bava films, for instance. And so we have this kind of set of Gialli, and there's a lot of different categories and subcategories of them. but there's a lot of them that are really, really influenced by sort of like more of this domesticated drama that deals a lot with sort of like the societal and gender roles that the characters have within society. So, and I do think you can see a little bit of that post-Bird on some of these films. Maybe some like Strange Vice of Mrs. Ward kind of does a nice little marriage between those two concepts. But with these 60 Giallis, it really is the core of the story. So I think this film suffers from a lot of Giallo fans that will be like, oh, I'm coming in, I'm expecting a Giallo, and then they're waiting for the kills, and it just doesn't happen. Because this film is not a body count film. And if you were to tell me I'm going to watch an Umberto Lenzi film, who's known for his kind of like grindhouse mentality, shall we say, and a Giallo film, you would expect something very, very lurid, potentially quite sleazy. And while this film does have some sleaze elements to it, I would say that it is far more of kind of a domesticated thriller with a little bit of those little like 60s, 70s moments tossed in rather than a true Lenzi film that would kind of come later. And so Lenzi is a really interesting figure here because he directed films, Giallo films, pre-Bird and post-Bird. So this one comes 1 year before Bird. So Bird with the Crystal Plumage, not an influence on this film at all. So I did want to shout out the Fragments of Fear podcast. I listened to their podcast on this film a couple times, maybe a year or two ago, and then more recently as I was preparing for this. Just a really wonderful podcast. I'm sorry that they're not releasing episodes anymore. That is really a shame, as I think they were definitely one of the best kind of like English language Gialli content creators around. But they did do a number of episodes on films. This is probably one of the more major ones they did. I think their second episode was on this movie, and so they give a ton of great background information. They talk a lot about like kind of its place in Gialli, sort of like I just did too. So I don't want to take too much credit for that, but definitely check that out too. A couple other characteristics of these films that came before Argento directed his first movie. The jet set lifestyle was definitely a fairly important part, and a lot of these people in these films are definitely more kind of upper class and stuff like that, middle to upper class, committing kind of crimes and murders and things like that. So that is part of, I would say that is definitely one of the tropes that maybe is a little bit less well known if you just follow kind of the Argento onwards Gialli. So Luciano Martino is one person that was really shouted out by the Fragments of Fear podcast folks when they were mentioning sort of like these late Gialli. So he helped, he's one of those figures that absolutely is very undoubtedly underrated in the scene, and I'm happy that they pointed that out. He's most commonly probably associated with his brother, Sergio Martino, probably one of the big four Giallo directors. Lenzi you'd probably put in that 5-6 range if you were to kind of like rank the different Gialli directors. But he was a producer, and if you listen to interviews and stuff like that, he's referred to constantly throughout it. So I do really think he's someone that had his name as sort of a producer in the credits, but we as film viewers tend to see stuff as being very director-centric. So we might tend to discount sort of the contributions and stuff like that he gave. But he was, I believe, instrumental in casting Carol Baker in one of her first films, Sweet Body of Deborah in Italy. So, and she was one of those actresses that really did play quite a major part in a lot of those Gialli that came out just around this early period in like the late 60s, early 70s. So she's in quite a bit. There's a great box set that came out a year or two ago called Baker and Lenzi that includes this film, and I believe 4 or 5 others that they did together. So it's definitely interesting to look at those films as a whole. So wanted to shout out Luciano Martino because, the producer probably not getting quite the credit that he deserves there. So, I've talked a lot about kind of like the place in history as far as this film goes. This film really is kind of a very domesticated thriller. It focuses a lot on John, the character here, and sort of how he is fitting into society or struggling to fit in. And he seems to want to play sort of the role of kind of the very traditional male, sort of the protector and things like that. And so the way that it's set up is he really they really play into that sort of savior complex that he has here. Rather than being kind of a total shitbag, like the husband in Diabolique, John, I would say, is definitely a significantly better person and kind of a more sympathetic figure. And so the writing for it is quite good, and I would say the performance is also quite good too. The only part that I will say that I did laugh a little bit at Jean-Louis Trignan's performance is where he's jet skiing. He just sort of has this like look that he's like super uncomfortable, but I think he's supposed to be happy when he's jet skiing, so it just got me to crack up both times I've seen it. It's just a very memorable face, so let me know if you had a similar reaction to that or not. So yeah, he's just really good. He's just one of those really high quality actors in these films, and these films don't always necessarily have super high quality acting or writing and things like that. So having Gastaldi and a really strong protagonist, as well as Carol Baker in this film, just is a really solid backbone to create this sort of really interesting story that happens. So what happens is he eventually kind of meets up with this character, Nicole, played by Carol Baker, the same name as Diabolique, and basically Nicole, he interprets it as she needs saving from kind of this more abusive relationship. Hints of Strange Vices of Mrs. Ward, directed by Luciano Martino's brother, and written by Gastaldi as well. And so it really just kind of sets him up and plays into him that way. I am going to be spoiling this film, so if you are interested in watching the film spoiler-free and you have not seen it, please do check it out. So, and the structure of these films is also really interesting. It reminds me a bit of Psycho, just the way it's done, in the sense that, like, about half or 2/3 the way through the film, we have a fairly major twist. One character goes away. We kind of start following these other characters and stuff like that, and really decenters the film. And I always really like it when it does that. Like Torso, Stage Fright, Aquarius, I think those films both do it really well too. And I think Gastaldi handles it. I'll give him credit because he's the writer, but Gastaldi and Lenzi handle it with a really sort of deft hand, and I do like how it's really well done. And it just sort of sets you just off balance enough. And for me, that's the twist that you sort of get instead of like kills or stuff like that. That just sort of keeps you interested and paying attention to the film and stuff like that. So I really like, even after you would think that once John leaves, because he's played by such a dynamic actor, that the film would start to lose steam. But for me, at least, the twists and stuff like that are enough to really carry it to the finish line and stuff like that. One thing that's also interesting is that this film is not lacking any style at all. I would say the cinematography is fine during this time. Europe in the 60s and 70s, it really is just undefeated. It's just a wonderful setting for these Gialli films, as well as the Eurocrime polizioteschi that would come a few years later. I think for me and for a lot of fans of the genre, just seeing Europe during this time and things like that is just a great setting, and that for me is just a huge draw to these different films. We've got a Riz Ortolani score, who is always just a solid composer, one of those Italians that has a bazillion credits to his name. Probably not his best work, but you know, an average score for a giallo is still like a really kick-ass score. So in that sense, it still is really good. So yeah, for me, I think it's a fun role for both Carol Baker and Jean-Louis Trintignant. I think it's a well-written film. I do tend to favor films from that later area post-Bird a little bit more than films from this era, but I think as far as kind of these Giallis and these thrillers, kind of in the mid to late 60s, this one's really solid. So I'm going to give this a 7 out of 10 rating. I think, for me, the thing that really holds this film up above all is the writing for it. Gastaldi did write Almost Human as well for Lenzi too, and I think that might be my absolute favorite Lenzi film. And I think a lot of it does have to do with kind of the overall structure being just, it's sort of like your building structure is just a little bit better and more robust. And I think they do tend to just really hold up on rewatches stuff. So I really did appreciate kind of the writing and some of the craftsmanship behind the scenes. So going to give Who Won to Ernesto Gastaldi in this one. Their writing directing partnership, I don't think they're terribly well known for working together. I think Gastaldi is overall probably most associated with those Sergio Martino Gialli that come later. I do prefer those Martino Giallis over this one generally, but this one I think is just, one grade down from those ones, and it's definitely a worthy one. And for me, at least, if I was to recommend any Baker and Lenzi one, this one might be the one for me, at least. I know everyone has kind of different preferences and stuff like that. And for me, some of those can be a little bit hit or miss, but I think this one is pretty solid, and I think it's really fascinating to look at it under the lens of it coming post-Diabolique, and that being the chief influence, rather than something like Blood and Black Lace and looking at it as sort of a proto-slasher. So yeah, thank you all for tuning in. Let me know how you like this review. If you think I should talk more about the film and less about the background, that sort of thing, let me know. But for me, at least, I find kind of like that meta-analysis to be really fun. So thank you all again, and hit that subscribe button if you'd like to see more videos. I'll see you all next time.